There is a story of a man who walked away from the noise of the city, away from the endless chatter of screens and streets, into the silence of his own mind. The world called him a recluse, a hermit, a man lost to the rhythms of modern life. But what if he wasn't lost at all? What if, in stepping away, he was the only one who truly found himself? Have you ever wondered what happens when a soul stops running from the quiet? When the distractions fade, the notifications cease, and all that remains is the echo of your own breath? Is it emptiness that greets you, or something far more terrifying? The revelation that you are not who you've been pretending to be? We live in a world that worships connection but fears communion with ourselves. We are told to network, to engage, to be seen and heard and validated at all costs. But what if the price of that constant connection is the loss of the only thing that ever truly belonged to us? Our solitude, our silence, our self. The philosopher Pascal once said that all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. And yet, we have built a society that treats solitude like a pathology, a condition to be medicated away with scrolling, swiping, and the relentless hum of companionship. But what if the opposite is true? What if solitude is not the enemy of survival, but the only way to endure the madness of modern life? Think of Nietzsche, who wandered the mountains of Sils Maria, writing in the cold clarity of isolation. One must still have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star, he said. And where does that chaos stir if not in the aloneness? The untouched depths of a mind left to its own devices? The world will tell you that to be alone is to be lonely, that to retreat is to surrender. But history's most profound thinkers, from Kierkegaard to Woolf, whisper a different truth. That solitude is the furnace of transformation. Imagine a woman who stops answering the calls, who lets the emails pile up, who steps off the treadmill of performative living. At first, the silence is deafening. She hears the ghosts of her own unmet potential, the dreams she abandoned to fit in, the voice she stifled to be loved. But then, something shifts. The silence stops being a void and becomes a mirror. She sees herself not as the world has shaped her, but as she truly is, raw, unfiltered, alive. And in that seeing, she discovers a power no algorithm can replicate, the power of unedited existence. Ask yourself, when was the last time you sat with yourself, truly sat, without reaching for a device, a drink, a distraction? What are you afraid you'll find in that stillness? The Stoics practiced premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils, not to dwell on suffering, but to confront the worst-case scenario and realize, I am still here. What if the worst-case scenario isn't loneliness, but the realization that you've spent your life surrounded by people and never once met yourself? There is a moment in every solitary journey when the mind stops fighting the quiet and begins to dance with it. When the absence of noise becomes the presence of something older, wiser, more resonant. The poet Rilke wrote, "The only journey is the one within." And yet, we have turned inwardness into a taboo, a sign of dysfunction. We pathologize the introvert, medicate the dreamer, and label the thinker too intense. But what if the intense ones are the only ones paying attention? Consider the story of the biologist who spent years alone in the Amazon, studying creatures that had never seen a human. When asked what he learned, he said, "I learned how to listen, not just to the forest, but to the parts of me that had been drowned out by civilization. What parts of you have been drowned out? What voice have you silenced to keep the peace, to avoid rocking the boat, to be palatable to a world that rewards conformity? The Japanese have a term, ma, the space between things, the pause between notes, the silence that gives sound its meaning. Modern society has abolished ma. We have filled every gap with content, every silence with small talk, every empty moment with stimulation. But what grows in the absence of ma? Anxiety, burnout, a soul-deep exhaustion that no vacation can cure. Now imagine a life where the silence is not an enemy, but an ally, where solitude is not a sentence, but a sanctuary. The mystic Teresa of Avila called it the interior castle, a place within where no external chaos can reach. But how do we find that castle when we've been taught to fear the path that leads there? The answer is simple, but not easy. We must stop confusing solitude for abandonment. We must see it for what it is, the ultimate act of self-reclamation. Every minute you spend alone without distraction is a minute spent rebuilding the parts of you that the world has eroded. And here's the secret. The more you do it, the less you'll fear it. The more you'll crave it. So I ask you again, what happens when a soul stops running? When the screens go dark, the crowd disperses and all that's left is you. And you? And you? Will you panic? Or will you finally hear the whisper you've been drowning out your entire life? There's a reason the world doesn't want you to seek solitude. Because solitude is where revolutions begin. Not just political revolutions, but the quiet, personal ones. The moment you realize you don't have to live by the script you were given, the moment you stop outsourcing your worth to likes, follows, and the approval of strangers, if this resonates with you, if you feel the pull of the unedited self, then you understand why we must keep going. There is more to uncover, more to unlearn. And if you're willing to walk this path a little further, stay with me. Like and subscribe, not for the algorithm, but for the conversation, for the chance to keep peeling back the layers together, because this is only the beginning, the first step into the quiet, the first breath of a life lived not in avoidance of solitude, but in reverence of it. What will you find when you dare to turn down the noise? Who will you meet when there's no one left to perform for? The answer is waiting. In the silence, we tell ourselves we are more connected than ever. A tap, a swipe, a click. Friendship distilled into pixels. Love reduced to heart emojis. But what if this hyperconnection is the grandest lie of our age? What if the more we link, the further we drift from anything real? Think of the last time you sat in a crowded room and felt utterly alone. The laughter around you like a foreign language, the conversations buzzing like static. This is the paradox of modern society. We have never been so surrounded, yet so starved of true presence. The philosopher Martin Buber spoke of the difference between I-it and I-thou relationships, between treating others as objects to be used and meeting them as sacred beings. But how can we meet another as a thou when we have forgotten how to meet ourselves? The screens we clutch like lifelines are not bridges, they are barricades. They give us the illusion of intimacy without the risk, the warmth of a voice without the weight of a gaze. We mistake being seen for being known. But knowledge, true knowledge, requires silence. It requires the space between words where meaning settles. And we have abolished that space. Ask yourself, when was the last time you looked into someone's eyes without glancing at your phone? When was the last time you listened, really listened, not to respond, but to understand? The tragedy is not that we are alone. It's that we have forgotten how to be alone, and so we have forgotten how to be with anyone else. There is a magic that happens in solitude, a slow, relentless alchemy. At first, it feels like dying. The ego thrashes, starved of validation, desperate for distraction. But then something shifts. The silence stops being an absence and becomes a presence. Imagine a writer who locks herself away for months, not to escape the world, but to meet the stories that only emerge in the quiet. Or a scientist who stumbles upon his greatest insight, not in the lab, but on a solitary walk. This is the secret the world doesn't want you to know. The most profound connections to art, to ideas, to the self are forged in solitude. The mystic Rumi said, "The quieter you become, the more you can hear." But what are we meant to hear? The voice that whispers beneath the noise of shoulds and musts. The voice that says, "This is not the life you are meant to live." Ask yourself, what has your solitude tried to tell you that you've been too busy to hear? To choose solitude in a world that demands constant connection is an act of rebellion. It is to say, I will not be commodified, I will not perform, I will not sell my attention to the highest bidder. Think of Emily Dickinson, who turned her isolation into a cathedral of poetry, or Nikola Tesla, who found his greatest visions in the depths of solitude. These were not broken people, they were breakers of molds. They understood that true creativity, true thought, requires the oxygen of silence. But society punishes this refusal to conform. It calls the solitary weird, cold, selfish, because a person who does not need the crowd is dangerous. A person who can think alone cannot be controlled. So I ask you, what would happen if you stopped fearing the label of loner? What power might you reclaim?